I would like to start perhaps by telling you a little bit about the science that I've had the privilege of being involved in, which is the study of our human DNA instruction book, the human genome. When the popular press reports on this, as they increasingly have been doing since the study of the human genome has gotten pretty far along, they invariably have covers, such as this one of Time magazine, that use double helix as the motif, because that is, after all, the wonderful structure of this wonderful molecule, the instruction molecule of all living things. They also, in this instance, seem to be depicting Adam and Eve, which is interesting as a question mark, perhaps, about whether these things are connected, and I will certainly argue that the faith and the science perspectives are appropriate to consider together. But I have a sneaking suspicion that they have another motivation, because I also notice in other magazines that have covers about DNA, they always feature not only double helixes, but naked people. And you can draw your own conclusion about what editors have decided about how to sell magazines. So we are going to talk about this molecule, this amazing double helix shown here spilling out of the nucleus of the cell, carrying the information that needs to be passed from parent to child, generation after generation, by the series of these chemical bases, here abbreviated A, C, G, and T. And it is the order of those letters that basically must be there in order to provide the instructions to take each organism from its original rather simple beginnings as a single cell to a rather fancy organism like a human being. The genome of an organism is its entire set of DNA instructions. The human genome adds up to 3.1 billion of those letters. And that is a phenomenal thing to think about. If we decided we were going to read the human genome tonight because it would be a useful thing to admire, we would probably regret it after we got started if we'd made a real commitment to do that, because we would be here reading at an average pace of A, C, G, T, T, and so on, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 31 years. And we have that information now, which is a pretty amazing thing to say, and you have it. Even before we knew its sequence, you had it already, and it's inside each cell of your body. And every time the cell divides, you've got to copy the whole thing. And occasionally mistakes get made, and if they get made during your life, well, they may not cause much trouble, but if they happen to get made in a particularly vulnerable place, they might start you on a path towards cancer. And if a mistake gets made in passing the DNA from parent to child, well, then that child might end up with some kind of a birth defect. But once in a very long time, that change might actually be beneficial. And that, of course, is how evolution works, with gradual change applied to this DNA sequence over long periods of time, resulting in what Darwin put forward by the means of natural selection, a gradual evolution and the introduction of new species. So DNA is, if you're a biologist, kind of the center here in terms of trying to understand how the whole system works. The Human Genome Project was proposed rather controversially in the late 1980s, and most of the scientific community was deeply skeptical about whether this was a good idea or not. It might cost too much money. It might not be feasible. It might just attract mediocre scientists because it seemed kind of boring. Well, none of those things turned out to be true. It certainly wasn't boring. And I'm happy to report that, in fact, it went better than expected. And for me, as the person who had the privilege of serving as the project manager of this enterprise, to be able to announce not just a draft, which we had in June of 2000, but a finished human genome in April 2003, exactly to the month, 50 years after Watson and Crick described the double helix, and completing all of the goals of the Genome Project more than 2 years ahead of schedule and more than $400 million under budget, doggone it, which doesn't happen very often. I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago. And I was scared, and I was afraid I was going to turn into somebody very somber and lose my sense of humor and probably be called to Africa the next week or something, but instead I discovered this great sense of peace and a joyfulness about having finally crossed that bridge, and also to have done so in a fashion that seemed to live up to my hopes that faith would not be something you had to plunge into blindly, but something where there was, in fact, reason behind the decision. Well, okay, this was an exciting time, but I was already a scientist, and I was already interested in genetics. So as I began to tell all these people that I knew of this good news, they said, "Doesn't your head explode?" "You're in trouble, boy. You're headed for a collision. These worldviews are not going to get along. And especially, isn't evolution incompatible with faith? What are you going to do about that?" So I had a lot of those conversations. In fact, I've continued to have those over the course of quite a few years. There was one in particular that left an indelible mark on me, and I thought, just for fun, I would share it with you, because the inquisitor in this case is somebody you might recognize, somebody with a rather quick intellect and a sharp way of trying to convey his point. And if you stay up late at night, you might have actually seen him before, because he tends to come on, I don't know what time zone we're in here, but he comes on pretty late, and it's Stephen Colbert. Well, that was a white-knuckled experience. I thought when I went to be on Colbert that we'd have a chance to talk about the plan before we're suddenly in front of millions of people, but that's not how it goes. I was there in the green room waiting for him to turn up. The clock's ticking. It's 5 minutes before showtime. He finally pops in and says, "Oh, you're Collins. I'm going to get you. You're going to go down." So that was the pre-interview. And so, okay, Stephen, what really is your problem here? Let's talk about this. If evolution is such a stumbling block in this science-faith conversation, we better ask the question whether it is well-founded or not. And certainly there are people saying evolution is on its last legs. Evolution is known by scientists to have many flaws, but nobody wants to admit it. What is the actual facts of the matter? Well, I can tell you from my perspective as somebody who studies DNA, that DNA has become probably the strongest window into this question that we could imagine. Darwin could not possibly have imagined a better means of testing his theory, except maybe for a time machine, because along comes DNA with its digital code, and it provides us insights that are really quite phenomenal. And in fact, the bottom line is that DNA tells us that Darwin's theory was fundamentally right on target. We have not worked out some of the mathematical details of some of this, but I think it's fair to say that here in 2009, serious biologists almost universally see evolution as so fundamental that you can't really think about life sciences without it at the core. So what's some of the evidence to support what I just said? Well, looking at the fossil record is one thing. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about DNA because I think it gives us more detailed information, but the fossil record is entirely consistent with what I'm going to say. We have, after all, compared now the genomes of multiple organisms. We not only sequenced the human genome, but the mouse, the chimpanzee, the dog, the honeybee, the sea urchin, the macaque, good heavens, the platypus. And those are just the ones that made the cover of Nature or Science. There's now about 30 more. And when you put the DNA sequences into a computer and ask the computer to make sense out of it, the computer doesn't know what any of these organisms look like, nor does it know about the fossil record. And the computer comes up with this diagram, which is a tree, an evolutionary tree, consistent entirely with descent from a common ancestor, a tree that includes humans as part of this enterprise, and which agrees in detail with trees that people have previously put together based upon anatomy or the fossil record. Now, you could argue, and people certainly have, that that doesn't prove that common ancestry is right. If all those organisms instead were created by God as individual acts of special creation, it's entirely plausible that God might use some of the same motifs in generating those organisms' genomes, and so the ones that looked most alike would have genomes that were most alike for functional reasons. And I could not refute that on the basis of this particular diagram. But let's look a little deeper. Let's look into the details of genes and also something called pseudogenes. And let me explain a particularly interesting feature of one little snippet of DNA as an example of this. So first of all, we're looking here at 3 genes that happen to be in the same order in humans, cows, mice, and quite a lot of other mammals as well. EPHX2, Gulo, and CLU are in that same order for these three species, which in itself is at least suggestive of a common ancestor. Otherwise, why would these genes be clumped together this way? They are totally different in their functions. There doesn't seem to be any logical reason why they need to be near each other, but they are. But I chose this particular set of genes for a reason, because they tell a very interesting story. Because for the cow and the mouse, all three of those genes are functional. For the human, the one in the middle, Gulo, when you look at its DNA sequence, it is really messed up. In fact, it is what we would call a pseudogene. About half of its coding region has been deleted. It's just not there. It cannot make a protein. It can't do much of anything except travel along from generation to generation as a little DNA fossil of what used to be there. Now, is there a consequence of this? By the way, this is a downgrade, not an upgrade. Most of our genes are not like this, but this one tells a particularly interesting story. So Gulo stands for galunolactone oxidase. What in the world is that? Well, that's the enzyme which is the final step in the synthesis of ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. And so it is because of that pseudogene, that deletion of Gulo, that those sailors got scurvy. But the mice on the ship didn't, because this is, for us as humans, one of those things that apparently we got along fine without, except in unusual circumstances. A mutation arose, there was no evolutionary drive to get rid of it, and so it is one we now have. We humans are altogether completely deficient in being able to make vitamin C, whereas other animals are not. Now, look at that picture and try to contemplate how that could have come about in the absence of a common ancestor. If you're going to argue that these are individual acts of special creation, then you would have to say that God intentionally placed a defective gene in the very spot where common ancestry would have predicted it to be. And God would have to do that, presumably, to test our faith. But that sounds like a God that I don't recognize. That sounds like a God who's involved in deception and not in truth. I could give you many more examples like this. But when you look at the details, it seems inescapable that evolution is correct and that we humans are part of that. Well, if that's true, does that leave any room for God? There are certainly those who are using evolution as a club over the head of believers. Richard Dawkins perhaps being the most visible, and this book has sold millions of copies. One of those rare books that does not need a subtitle to tell you what it's about. And Dawkins, who is an incredibly gifted writer and articulator of evolutionary theory for the general public, has shifted by the publication of this book into a very different space, where he has become really, in a very antagonistic way, a critic of religion, not only claiming that it is unnecessary and ill-informed, but that it is evil, and that religion is basically responsible for most of the bad things in the world. Dawkins uses science as a core of his argument, trying to demonstrate that in the absence of scientific proof of God's existence, the default answer should be that there is no God. So what then? How can evolution and faith be reconciled? Have I led us into a dilemma here by talking about my own faith conversion and then telling you that I think evolution is true? Well, actually, no. 40% of scientists are believers in a personal God. Most of them, from my experience, have arrived at the same way of putting this together, a way that is actually pretty simple and almost obvious, but it's amazing how little it gets talked about. And it goes like this. Almighty God, who is not limited in space or time, created our universe 13.7 billion years ago with that fine-tuning, the parameters precisely set to allow the development of complexity over long periods of time, all very intentional. God's plan included the mechanism of evolution. That was the way in which the marvelous diversity of living things on our planet was to come to be. And most especially, that plan included us, human beings. After evolution in the fullness of time, which is a long time for us, but maybe a blink of the eye for God, had prepared a sufficiently advanced neurological house, the brain, which would be pretty necessary for what's to come here, God then gifted humanity with free will and with a soul. Thus, humans at that point received this special status, which in biblical terms is made in God's image, but I don't think God is a kindly gentleman with a flowing white beard in the sky. I think made in God's image is about mind and not about body. We humans, having been given those gifts, and here you'll recognize the story of the Garden of Eden, used our free will to disobey God, leading to our realization of being in violation of the moral law, and thus we were estranged from God. For Christians, as I learned, as I was trying to figure this all out, Jesus is the solution to that estrangement. That's it. A very simple, but I think entirely compatible view that does no violence either to faith or to science and puts them in a harmonious position that both explains the way in which origins can be thought about and puts us in a position to be able to further explore the consequences. Now, this is often called theistic evolution. It's not a term that many people are all that comfortable with, including me. Evolution is the noun, theistic is the adjective, sort of sounds like you're tipping the balance there in the favor of the scientific view, and a lot of people aren't quite sure what theistic means anyway, so maybe we need a better term. One possibility is to think about what this means. Well, it means life, bios, by God speaking us into being, the logos. In the beginning was the Word, the first chapter of John. Life through the Word, bios through logos, or just simply biologos. And that is perhaps a useful alternative instead of theistic evolution. And in that regard, as the title of my book indicates, then maybe we could think about this universal code of life, the DNA molecule, as the language of God. Well, you were probably already thinking of objections, and that's good, and I'm sure we'll hear a few more in a little bit. What are the things that trouble people about this synthesis? Is this just a little too easy? Well, some people are troubled about the long time that evolution seemed to require to do this, and why would God be so slow in getting to the point? Well, after all, that's our perspective, because we are limited by this arrow of time where yesterday had to come before today, and that had to come before tomorrow. But remember that thing about God having to be outside of time in order to make sense as a creator? Well, that solves this one too. Because if God is outside of time, then a process that seems really long to us may be incredibly short to God. And tied along with that, isn't evolution a purely random process, and doesn't that take God out of it? Well, again, it might seem random to us, but if God is outside of time, randomness doesn't make sense anymore, and God could have complete knowledge of the outcome in a process that seemed random to us, and I suppose in that way you could say God is inhabiting the process all the way along. I don't think this is a fundamental problem, despite the way it is often portrayed as such. This is the intelligent design question. Can evolution really account for all of those fancy structures that we have inside our cells? The favorite poster child of ID being the bacterial flagellum. So what's the argument here? Well, the bacterial flagellum is this little outboard motor that allows bacteria to zip around in a liquid solution. And that flagellum has about 32 proteins that must come together in just the right way for the whole thing to work. And if you inactivate just one of those 32 proteins, it doesn't work. So in a simplistic way, you would really begin to wonder how this could ever come to pass on the basis of evolutionary steps, because how could you have, just by chance, 31 of those proteins coming along with no positive benefit, and only when you got the 32nd one would something be of value and that organism would have a reproductive advantage? That doesn't seem to be mathematically feasible, and it isn't if you think of it in those terms. If you look at the more recent data, now that we have lots and lots of genomes, so we can make lots and lots of predictions about these various protein complexes, including the bacterial flagellum, it does not appear that these emerged all of a sudden. In fact, what appears to be the case is that even a multi-protein wonder like the flagellum was constructed by recruiting, bit by bit, proteins that had other functions. Presumably the genes for those proteins got duplicated, so the old function was maintained, but the new copy had a chance to take on a new function. And given sufficient time, which evolution offers you, I think the vast majority of biologists who've looked closely at this do not see any reason why one has to invoke a supernatural influence in order to achieve the complexity that we see in the clotting system or the eye or the bacterial flagellum. And in that case, that doesn't sound so different than the standard process of gradual change over time with natural selection acting upon it. So ID turns out to be, and I'm sorry to say this for those who have found this a very appealing perspective, but I think it is the truth, that ID turns out to be putting God into a gap in scientific knowledge which is now getting rapidly filled. And that God of the gaps approach has not served faith well in the past, and I don't think it serves it well in this instance either. And unfortunately, the church has in many ways attached themselves to ID theory as a way of resisting what was apparently a materialistic and atheistic assault coming from the evolutionists. But attaching yourself to an alternative theory which itself turns out to be flawed is not going to be a successful strategy. And I think it's an unnecessary strategy, because if you think about it, ID is not only turning out to be science that's hard to defend, it's also sort of an unusual kind of theology, because it implies that God wasn't quite getting it right at the beginning and had to keep stepping in and helping the process along because it wasn't capable of generating the kind of complex structures that were needed for life. Wouldn't it actually be a more awesome God who started the process off right at the beginning and didn't have to step in that way? I might think so. And then the one that I think is most of concern to believers, and I'm sure there are people in this room who are already in that circumstance and wondering, now wait a minute, how do you really rectify what you just said about evolution with Genesis 1 and 2? And probably resonated a bit with the caricature that Colbert was presenting of that view. Well, all of this comes down to, what does science say and what does the Scripture say, and are they really in conflict? And that requires one to get deeply into the question of scriptural interpretation. What is the meaning of a verse? What was the intention of the author? Who was it intended to be written to? What is the original language? What do those words mean in that language? Does this read like history of an eyewitness? Does this read like something that is more mythical and lyrical and poetic? I'm not an expert in that area of hermeneutics, but there are a lot of people who have spent their lives on that. And ultimately, when it comes down to that conflict between Genesis and science, it does seem that the conflict primarily results from an interpretation that insists on a literal reading, and that literal reading is actually a relatively recent arrival on the scene, with many deep thinkers in theology down through the centuries not having the sense at all that that was a required interpretation. Furthermore, if you read Genesis 1 and 2 carefully, and do that tonight if you're interested, you will notice that there are two stories of creation, and they don't quite agree in terms of the order of appearance of plants and humans. So they can't both be literally correct. So maybe that's supposed to be a suggestion to us as we read those, that there is something more intended here than a scientific treatise. Given all of that, I think it is entirely possible to take those words in Genesis and fit them together with what science is teaching us about origins. And I was particularly gratified, as I was wrestling with that, to run across the writings of St. Augustine. Augustine was mentioned in the introduction in a wonderful quote read from Augustine by Professor Christoph Koch. And Augustine was obsessed about this question of Genesis, wrote no less than 4 books about it, and try to figure out what the meaning was. And ultimately concluded that there was no real way to know precisely what was intended by those verses, and warned in a very prescient way 1,600 years ago that people should be very careful, therefore, not to attach themselves to a particular interpretation that might turn out, when new discoveries were made, to be indefensible. Here's that exhortation. Writing about Genesis, in matters that are so obscure and far beyond our vision, we find in Holy Scripture passages which can be interpreted in very different ways without prejudice to the faith we have received. In such cases, we should not rush in headlong and so firmly take our stand on one side that if further progress in the search for truth, which sounds a bit like science, justly undermines this position, we too fall with it. I wish that exhortation were referred to more often.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is really awesome talk. I was thinking one of the ideas and beliefs held by people is that God created a mature creation, and since the point he created it with dead fossils in the ground, oil, monkeys and sea creatures and people, that it has continued to evolve, but that evolution kind of like follows the same path of the evolution that most people believe in, but it started at a mature point. Mm-hmm. So I know that you kind of touched on some things like your beliefs, why it's evolution in the several billion years, but I just wondered if you could talk about that, what you think about that idea.
So the evidence for that comes from several sources. One is about the age of the universe and the age of the Earth. We calculate the age of the universe by basically looking at the galaxies flying apart and figuring out if they're going that fast, how long must they have been doing that to have started in a single point? And that comes out to this number of about 13.7 billion years. We have other ways of figuring out the age of the Earth, particularly with various radioisotope dating. And when you put all that together, it's remarkable how consistent it is. It's not like you get a different number depending on the method. And the Earth's age now is 4.55 billion years, plus or minus a couple percentage points. It's very tightly consistent with all of the data. So I'd have to somehow discount that to say that God started the process much later. Or I would have to say that God intentionally put evidence into the creation that made it look like it was old when it really wasn't. And again, we're into that concept of the God of deception instead of the God of truth. And when you think about it, you've got to go to some pretty great lengths. There are photons hitting us that came from distant stars that have been traveling for millions of years before they got to us. And you would have to then say that God set all those photons at just the right place to make it look like they've been traveling for millions of years, but he really got them started much more recently. This is a lot of work. And again, if you don't see, as I don't, from the scripture, a requirement to postulate that recent origin, and you see all this scientific data that says the Earth and the universe are old, well, let's make the obvious conclusion. They're old, and that's what the scripture must have been telling us after all, because that possibility, as Augustine points out, was very much one of the things on the list that might be being described in Genesis.
I was wondering, if we accept the biologos perspective, are we able to say that our current evolutionary state is the final state as the image of God? My concern is the direction that post-humanists such as Nick Bostrom, the Future Humanity Institute at Oxford, would like to accelerate human evolution to a malleable form.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think it's fair to say that human evolution has not stopped even on a natural basis, because we are still exposed to various pressures that are shaping our genome. You can see that, for instance, in the last 10 or 20,000 years in skin color. Most of the people I see in this room are mutants. I'm sorry, you are. You have white skin, and that was not the original human skin color. And if I'd tested your DNA, you would be having 2 copies of a mutation in the gene called SLC24A5, which is normally responsible for making skin dark, and all of us white people have acquired mutation in that. And it was selected for because we were living up there in Northern Europe where there wasn't a lot of sunlight, and with dark skin in that situation, you have a high chance of getting rickets, and it's difficult to have children if you have rickets, and so you can see how that selective process would have worked. Those of you who can drink milk or eat ice cream tonight, you were also mutants, because that was not the original human form. But cultures that began using milk as part of their diet, there were rare individuals who could do that digestion, and that has now spread through most European cultures. And interestingly, on an independent mutational basis to the Maasai, who also have milk in their diet but have a different way of having gotten there. So evolution is still at work on us. But I think your question also was, is evolution going to be something we take charge of? Are we going to decide that we're just not far enough along and try to improve ourselves? Stephen Hawking has certainly made the case that we should do that, and you can sort of understand how somebody who has had such a serious long-term physical illness might imagine that improvement would be a good thing. There are a number of scientific problems about how to do that and whether it's ethical to do that, because it means messing with the human germline, which is not something that we think would be necessarily safe. And it also means that somebody has to decide what's an improvement. We haven't done such a good job of that in the past. And of course, there would be this issue about who gets access to this and who doesn't. So it is an issue. We're going to have to come to grips with it. We don't know how to do it right now, so we've got some time to think about it. For a believer, there's all sorts of other religious implications. If we take charge of our own evolution and become another species, are we still in God's image? Or have we become in our own image? And that deserves some serious thought. Yeah.
I've just been told that the Q&A question is going to end in 17 minutes at 21:50.
Okay.
I'll try and make this quick. You seem to use the sloppiness of DNA to support of common ancestry, and I think that's a really strong point. The only problem I've seen in my particular study of it is the mitochondria and how all of its DNA is in the nucleus. Mm-hmm. With the symbiotic theory and that sort of thing, it would seem that maybe some would be in the mitochondrial DNA in some organisms, and then you'd see some variability upon the transition to the nucleus with those.
So mitochondria do have a genome, and they do encode some of their genes, but many of the mitochondrial proteins are encoded in the nucleus.
Yeah.
So help me understand.
It would
the
seem
question.
to me that in different organisms right now, there would be different proportions of the electron transport chain found in the mitochondrial DNA and found in the nuclear DNA, but they all seem to be in the nuclear DNA. I don't know.
So I don't know the comparative mitochondrial genomics well enough to know just if there's any variability in that. If there's not, I mean, one conclusion could be that this is a very ancient event, that symbiotic arrival of the mitochondria being engulfed by a cell, and then in the course of some long period of time, gradually arriving at a stable situation. And that was still the common ancestor. And so all of the follow-ons have had that same arrangement of which genes are in the mitochondria and which are in the nucleus. That would be sensible. And I'm way outside the data here because I'm not absolutely sure that's right.
Yeah, it would just seem that would take a while.
It would take a while. But we have a while, you know.
Oh yeah, but you might
3 billion
diverge from
years
there.
is a long time.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Like yourself, I've really been encouraged by Augustine's discussion of Genesis and the realization that Christianity has not been forced necessarily to revise its understanding of the earliest parts of Genesis by aggressive advances in science.
Well said.
But I'm continually concerned, though, with how we are to square the tension, not between evolution and Genesis, but, say, evolution and the Pauline corpus, which declares that on some level, death is the result of human sin, whereas evolution says that death has been integral to the process of creation.
I think this is one of the questions that troubles a lot of serious Christians. How do you make sense of Romans 5? How do you make sense of 1 Corinthians 15, which has another allusion to the idea of death and Adam as the first man that brought this on? So going back to the scriptures in terms of the death that's being described, I do not believe that it is excluding animal death before the fall. It really is talking about humans. And of course, evolution, by definition, from all of the fossil record and all the other things we know about it, did involve animal death. But what about humans? This sort of comes down to, were humans fully human before Adam arrived on the scene? Or were they, in a certain way, Homo sapiens waiting to become Homo divinus, the actual infusion of the soul and the free will? If one wants to take that tack, then you could say that until Adam arrived, there was no human death because there were no real humans. They were not fully breathed by God into the image. And that could potentially solve the problem. But I have certainly, again, I should have said at the beginning, I'm not a theologian. I'm happy to say that I know some, and I'm happy to say that they've taught me a lot, but I could easily get into hot water and commit a heresy if I go too far along this road. I do know theologians who are convinced, though, that the other reading of that scripture is that what's being talked about is not physical death, but spiritual death. And that sort of can be understood in the sense, you know, what the statement was of God to Adam and Eve: if you eat of that fruit, you shall surely die. And they ate of the fruit, and they did not die, not immediately, but they were expelled from the garden. They died a spiritual death. If that interpretation is the intended one, then the problems go away. The 1 Corinthians 15 is a bit of a problem for that one because it really makes it sound like physical death. Again, I'm not going to tell you with many of these questions that there is an answer, but I think in every instance I know about, and you can look at these 33 questions on the website in a month and see examples, there are possible answers, and I think we as thoughtful scientist believers ought to be careful not to say more than we know. And if you can come up with 3 or 4 answers and lay them out, well, that's what you should do, and say somewhere in here is the truth, but we probably don't have enough data to know which one is right. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Collins. Interestingly, just this afternoon, I heard a radio program about a book called Born to be Good, The Science of a Meaningful Life. It's by Dasher Keltner, I believe. And it talks about the evolution of gratitude, compassion, altruism, and all that. And he cites a study from Israel that has supposedly identified a gene coding for altruistic and moral behaviors. Can you just comment on that and sort of what your feeling is towards that?
I don't know that particular gene. It is possible by personality tests to categorize people in terms of their level of generosity and altruism. And if you look at identical twins, they tend to be more alike than people who aren't related. So that might tell you that there are some hereditary influences on being generous and altruistic, but they're going to be pretty minor compared to other influences, and particularly free will decisions. And if, in fact, there are some neurological pathways that play a role in altruism, that in no way seems to me to reduce the likelihood that this is a divinely inspired action on the part of humans. After all, it has to have some mechanism of being implemented. Similarly, when you see these exciting stories of imaging that's done on people who are in deep meditation, feeling a deep prayer life, and it shows a certain part of the brain lights up that normally wouldn't, some people would look at that and go, aha, you see, that says that it's not a real event. Other people say, well, that proves it is a real event. If there's going to be a spiritual experience or a special human attribute in terms of altruism, it has to have some way of being carried out. And if that involves some genes and some neurons, well, of course, it seems like it would have to.
Thank you, Dr. Collins, for your presentation. One question that keeps coming to mind is that the evidence that you presented, all the evidence, can be used to account for either a theistic or a naturalistic perspective. And that at least seems to suggest that the issue cannot be settled on evidence alone. It seems to me rather that there's a pre-commitment to a particular paradigm, worldview, conceptual scheme, whatever you call it, that then sometimes even selects the evidence, or in any instance, the evidence gains its intensity, meaning whatever you may call it, within this particular conceptual scheme. And therefore, the internal consistency, coherence, and so on within the conceptual scheme establish a preconceived conclusion. In other words, isn't one position just as good as the other? And if you cannot establish one position over the other just based on evidence, how does a naturalist become a theist?
So great question and well phrased. Again, I think you're referring to the evidence that supports evolution and the relatedness of living organisms. That can certainly be supported on a purely naturalistic basis, and is by somebody like Dawkins, who completely agrees with everything I said about the evidence for the relatedness of living organisms. But that was actually part of the presentation to say that if you are a believer and you find it necessary to deny evolution's truth because it's a threat to faith, there's a problem here because the evidence seems pretty strong. The evidence for the spiritual perspective was not showing the vitamin C problem with the gulo gene. The evidence for the spiritual perspective was more from the idea of where did the universe get started, and what about the mathematical fine-tuning, and what about the moral law, which seems to be outside of a purely evolutionary explanation. Not proofs, mind you, but compelling, I think, in their own way, and pushing one into a perspective that is not just naturalistic, but cries out for something more than that. And again, the way you ask the question also seemed to imply that you have to be one or the other. And my whole point from my own experience is that that impoverishes you. That if you decide you're only going to be a scientific worldview person or only going to be a spiritual worldview person, you've missed out on the opportunity to be a whole person. And that you can, in fact, find God in the laboratory just as you can find God in the cathedral. And the idea that these cannot coexist or that you have to build a really high firewall between them is a relatively recent idea, and I think a flawed idea, and one that we as a culture should not so easily buy into as we seem to have done so far.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.